Hi, I'm Eugenie Bondurant, and I played Tigress in Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2. And I am thrilled to be reading with you the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Shall we read it together?
The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes
by Suzanne Collins.
Chapter 1.
The Mentor.
Coriolanus released the fistful of cabbage into the pot of boiling water
en zwoer dat hij het op de dag nooit meer zou hoeven eten.
But this was not that day.
He needed to eat a large bowl of the anemic stuff and drink every drop of broth to prevent his stomach from growling during the reaping ceremony.
It was one of a long list of precautions he took to mask the fact that his family,
despite residing in the penthouse of the capital's most opulent apartment building,
was as poor as district scum.
That at 18, the heir to the once great house of snow
had nothing to live on but his wits.
His jet for the reaping was worrying him.
He had an acceptable pair of dark dress pants, bought on the black market last year.
But the shirt was what people looked at.
Fortunately, the Academy provided the uniforms it required for daily use.
For today's ceremony, however, students were instructed to be dressed fashionably.
But with the solemnity the occasion dictated.
Tigris se basait se paya. Yariel se baza.
Only his cousin's cleverness with a needle had saved him so far.
Still, he couldn't expect miracles.
The shirt they dug from the back of the wardrobe, his father's from better days,
was stained and yellowed with age. Half the buttons missing, a cigarette burn on one cuff.
Too damaged to sell even in the worst of times, and this was to be his reaping shirt?
This morning he had gone to her room at daybreak,
only to find both his cousin and shirt missing.
Not a good sign.
Had Tigress given up on the old thing and braved the black market?
In some last-ditch effort to find him proper clothing?
And what on earth would she possess worth trading for it?
Only one thing. Herself. And the House of Snow had not yet fallen that far. Or was it falling now as he salted the cabbage?
Hi everyone, I'm Sydney Bucksbaum from Entertainment Weekly, and while I'm sad we can't all be together in New York for New York Comic Con this year, at least we can all gather virtually to talk all things pop culture. And I am so excited to be joined by two Hunger Games experts, or game makers if you will, for a deep dive into the Hunger Games universe. This wide-ranging discussion is going to look back on the original 3 books and their film adaptations, plus take fans inside the new prequel book and its upcoming movie adaptation, for the first time ever bringing these creative professionals behind both the books and the movies together for one must-see event. So let the games begin. I'm joined by David Levithan, publisher of the Hunger Games books, and Nina Jacobson, the producer of the Hunger Games films. Thanks for zooming in today, guys.
Pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, of course. And obviously, while 2020 hasn't been the best year, it's actually a great time to be a Hunger Games fan with the release of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which took us all back into the world of Panem. But before we talk about the new prequel, let's first take a walk down memory lane with the original franchise. So David, before Suzanne Collins wrote The Hunger Games, Scholastic actually published her first series, the Underland Chronicles. So tell me, how did you first hear about her idea for a new book franchise?
Well, Suzanne, again, we had wrapped up Underland Chronicles, which had been sort of an examination for middle grade readers of war and its costs. But then she came to us with a proposal for something new that was, again, examining war, but on an older level. And it was just astonishing. There was a very brief proposal. The first book was somewhat fleshed out. The second book, not as much. And the third book was maybe a paragraph. I was like, wait, what happens? What happens? But it immediately we knew that it was going to be something really spectacular, and that while the concept, we wouldn't have necessarily trusted any author with it, we knew that Suzanne really was the perfect author to tell the story.
Mm-hmm. And Nina, when did you first read The Hunger Games?
Well, it's funny because I first read The Hunger Games. It was already out in bookstores, and a colleague of mine, Brian Unkelis, who had loved the Gregor Chronicles, picked it up at a bookstore because he loved the previous series. And so he read it. He was like, you got to read it. And, the book was published. Catching Fire was in manuscript form, but hadn't come out yet. And I picked it up. I could not put it down. I became obsessed with it. And I spent, having been a studio executive, especially at Disney where I was, I spent so much of the book, the first book, thinking like, I don't know how she's going to pull this off. Like, what's going to happen when Katniss has to kill somebody in the Hunger Games? Like, how am I going to stay with her when she has to do what she's going to have to do? And to see the kind of razor's edge that Suzanne managed to walk on throughout the book of really exploring and condemning violence without ever glamorizing it. It was such an incredible achievement, and I could not put it down, and I could not stop thinking about it. And I became really obsessed with producing it, and obsessed with the idea of how horrible it would be if I didn't get to be the one to produce it. And so I began a relentless offensive to win over Suzanne.
Yeah, Nina, I definitely wanted to ask you, did you know immediately after reading it that you were going to be the one to help bring the story from the page to the screen?
Well, I hoped I was going to be the one, but there were other producers out there. Suzanne was very clear. So the first book, without having whoever would be adapting it read Catching Fire. She wanted them to understand, whoever it was going to be, the journey and the trajectory. And so I was then allowed to read the Catching Fire manuscript, and we talked about it within the context of the whole series. But yes, I became, like I say, the idea that I really felt like I had to do it. And if I couldn't do it, I honestly didn't know how I was going to be able to stand the frustration of watching somebody else do it.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so for both of you, what did you see in that first book that made you realize that this was going to be something so big? Because in both of your lines of work, you read a lot of books.
I mean, I think going off of what Nina said, I mean, it was the obsessive reaction of everybody who read it, and the fact that we were not just telling our colleagues that they had to read it, we were telling our mothers they had to read it, we were telling our children they had to read it. Like, really, once you read it, it just was such an extraordinary melding of sort of edge of your seat storytelling with all of this substantive content. It just wasn't like anything else you had read before. And it made us all evangelical about making sure other people read it. And again, I remember when we first met Nina and her group, I mean, it was amazing. It was like two different sides of the evangelical family meeting for the first time, because we did have this really unique passion behind the story and passion behind getting the story out there that is very, very rare to see.
Mm-hmm. And did you ever imagine that it would grow into the franchise that it is today?
I mean, I think you would have to have like delusions of grandeur to imagine what would become of it. I mean, when we would go on the junkets for the movies and you would go around the world and you would see the level of like just honest fervor and intense commitment that people felt to the books and the movies. For you to imagine that something like that would ever happen, you would be like, you can't imagine that. Like, that would feel like it was hoping for too much and imagining too much. It was beyond anything I think anybody could imagine.
Mm-hmm. And so, Nina, what were some challenges that you had to overcome in adapting the Hunger Games into the massive film franchise that it became?
Well, I would say that, there were a few real challenges. I would say the biggest challenge was going back to what I'd said about that first read, which is that there's a tonal bandwidth that Suzanne achieves in which, say, she doesn't pull her punches, and yet at the same time, she never turns the games into the entertainment that the Capitol wants them to be. Like, so you have this sort of high wire act where if you softened it too much, let's say by aging up the characters, which is something that would be a very typical studio note, which is part of why we didn't go to a very typical studio. If you aged up the characters, it would be more bearable, but it shouldn't be more bearable. if you stylize the violence like the way, you might see, in a Quentin Tarantino film or something like that, it's not that those aren't entertaining, but if you did that, then you'd be guilty of the crimes of the Capitol. So you have these kind of, both either if you ended up on the wrong side of your high wire, you ended up with a lot of ways to do it wrong and not a lot of ways to do it right. And so being able to sort of follow the North Star of Suzanne's instincts, that was a challenge to adapt a film while keeping that tonal bandwidth. And then I think as it became so popular and fans became so vocal, on the one hand, being mindful as a fan myself of like what fan feelings are and how as a fan I felt. And on the other hand, kind of getting inside the bubble of our story and our movie and letting it evolve from the inside out like any good story does, as opposed to the outside in, which I think tends to make things feel false.
Mm-hmm. And so what do you think would surprise fans to know about what it was like actually bringing the Hunger Games films to life?
Well, I mean, I think obviously, every movie sort of pretends like, oh, we're so tight, we're one big family. I think that actually people will be surprised at how tight of a group we really did become and how close-knit and what a family the group of people who made those first, 4 movies together became, and that wasn't just like a, put it on for the EPK kind of thing. I think that what else do I think people would be surprised by? I think that just the amount, I don't think anybody can ever really imagine the amount of thought and care that goes into like every little decision. And if Frances were here to speak to that, or one of our, we had a couple of amazing wardrobe costume designers on the movies, and from Kurt and Bart and Trish Somerville. We had, I think, and on the first movie as well, we had so much just incredibly gifted artistry and so much care that went into every little detail, and anything that diverged from the book was carefully considered. Anything that was going to be exactly true to the book was carefully considered. So just the obsessive attention to detail maybe might surprise people.
Mm-hmm. And David, when you first saw the first film adaptation, what scene really surprised you based on what you had been imagining ever since you read the manuscript?
I mean, again, it was something that I was surprised by how accurate it was. I mean, to the vision I had in my head of this story that I had been living with at that point for many years, it was almost surreal to see it rendered so authentically. And again, it's strange to talk about authenticity with a fictional world, but it was. I mean, Jennifer Lawrence, was Katniss. And again, this is not somebody that there was any ambiguity about how I felt while I was reading her. I had a very clear vision of who she was and what she meant. And to see that rendered note perfect was astonishing to me, because again, adaptations can sometimes veer very, very widely from the source material. And again, sometimes still maintain the spirit, but this one maintained the spirit and was completely true to the books. And that was amazing. And again, as far as the things that were amazing to me, again, when Rue, when what happens to Rue, the fact that I was sitting there weeping for this event that I knew was going to happen. I knew exactly every beat of that moment, but the fact that the film brought it to such life, even to somebody as familiar as me, to get not just an intellectual response, but an emotional response, that was probably the highest compliment I can give.
Mm-hmm. And Nina, what was your favorite scene or most challenging scene to bring to life from any of the movies?
Boy. Obviously, some of the stuff we shot on both Catching Fire and Mockingjay, they were really difficult production-wise, in terms of like either tunnels or swampy creature attacks and things like that. Some of those things were quite challenging physically. We also had a crazy thing on Catching Fire where when he was practicing his learning stunts, Sam Claflin, who played Finnick, threw a punch that hit a stuntman, and the stuntman was okay, but Sam Claflin broke his hand right before we started shooting. And so we had to quickly get him to a doctor, and then we had to adjust for his little like long sleeve, spandex outfit to go over his cast on his hand so that you couldn't see that he was wearing cast. So that was a big event right before we started. But I love that the stuntman, like, he's fine, but the guy who hits him is the one who breaks his hand. So that was a bit of a shocker. Like saying there was like, a lot of like mud and bugs and things like that, just your basic production challenges. But obviously our biggest challenge was really just the really devastating, shocking thing that happened when we were making Mockingjay with Philip Seymour Hoffman. Like that has something that it's like so unimaginable, and it was so like just it was on a weekend, and you just all of a sudden your whole idea of this person and where they were in their lives and what it means to your show, and it will all so happen so suddenly, and having to figure out how to respond in a way that was respectful to him as an actor, his family, and to our cast and crew, who was obviously also really stunned and in mourning. So obviously, ultimately, beyond the basic production challenges, the loss of a cherished cast member, was really a shocker and by far our greatest challenge.
Mm-hmm. I can't even imagine what that must have been like, but I feel like you all handled it very respectfully, and I think that the fans definitely appreciated how you handled it.
Yeah, it was definitely one of the hardest things any show can go through. It's something where like, because we're making movies, we're not curing cancer. And so how do you come back together? How do you really honor that person in their absence?
Mm-hmm. And it's been 10 years since the final book in the Hunger Games trilogy was released, and 5 years since the last Hunger Games movie came out. So the release of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes earlier this summer was really amazing for fans, because we got to return to Panem through the eyes of, surprisingly, a young President Snow before he became the ultimate Hunger Games villain. And the prequel book served both as an origin story for Snow as well as the Hunger Games, revealing how and why the gruesome event became what it was in Katniss's time. So David, when did you find out that Suzanne was going to return to the world of the Hunger Games for this prequel book?
I mean, I found out about 2.5 years before I was allowed to tell anybody else. So that was its own challenge, but in a really exciting way. And again, it was really interesting because really, and Suzanne has said this when talking about the book, she approached it really because she wanted to talk about the philosophy behind it and human nature, and sort of how does human nature and sort of the Locke versus Rousseau battle turn into sort of who Snow becomes. And that was fascinating to me. And so I would get bits and pieces over the years until really she was writing in earnest. And then it was still top secret. But it was the conversations we had were as much about philosophy as they were about character.
Mm-hmm. And so when you finally got to read Ballad for the first time, what was your reaction to it?
I mean, I loved it. I mean, it's interesting that there's another editor, Kate Egan, and I were working on it together. And I, for whatever reason, loved, like, the minute I was in Coriolanus Snow's head, I was all in. I was like, this is, I don't like him, but I really am fascinated by him. And her reaction was more like, this guy, I know this guy. I don't like being in a room with this guy. And then, of course, as it became clear what Suzanne was doing with the character, both of us were totally enthralled. But it was interesting. I definitely had less resistance to his charms. But it was amazing because it really, as you said, we see the evolution of Snow, and that's interesting. But to me, the more interesting part was seeing the evolution of Panem and seeing the Hunger Games in its 10th year and seeing how rudimentary it was, and seeing how all of the themes and all of the ideas that we'll see later in the trilogy are having their origin story. And just the notion when you see them in the trilogy, it's a foregone conclusion. The Hunger Games is what it is. Yeah. It is evil, it is punitive. But seeing it where it didn't have to go that direction, and seeing where it sort of wobbled, and you see how the forces sort of pushed it into existence, who did, that was fascinating to me, because I think there are lessons to be learned about human nature and about societies and governments that we would really do well to listen to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what surprised me the most was obviously we all had our perceptions going into the book of, or the prequel of who Snow was and that this would be his origin story. And I think what took me by surprise was how much we really didn't realize that this was also going to be the origin for the Hunger Games itself. And I think that was my favorite part of the book. So I'm always curious to hear what people actually thought after they finished reading, because going into it, hearing that it's about a young President Snow, we all have our predictions and our assumptions of what it's going to be. And that I think that they all definitely changed throughout the reading of it.
Yeah, and I think everybody at first thought it was going to be like a fallen angel story, that like, oh, it's going to be, Snow is going to be a hero and then something happens and he becomes bad. But I think what Suzanne shows, it was so much more complicated than that. It was, no, his personality was what it was, but it was outside forces that either amplify pieces of who you are or help you go a different direction. And you see that tug of war in this book.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so, Nina, when you heard the news that Suzanne was writing a Hunger Games prequel, was your first thought, here we go again?
I mean, of course, I was ecstatic about it. Suzanne wasn't sure for a while, I think, if she wanted to go back to Panem, even though I know in her mind she knows the story of the past and the evolution. It's all in her head. But whether she actually wanted to sit down to write that story was something that, I hoped that she would, and especially as our country's history has been so dramatic in these last few years. I hope that she would, and I think it's really interesting that one of the book's big ideas that it explores is what is the attraction of authoritarianism? Why do some people want or believe they need a government with an iron fist, that and the certainty that comes from that kind of leadership, and what people's ideas are about what we owe each other, or what our rights are as individuals versus what the role of the state should be. And in the same way that I think that, the first books, both in their sort of exploration of war and violence, but also of resistance and defiance, were very much books written for the times that we are living in now and then. And I think this book is every bit as timely and relevant as the first books were, but in new ways that were unexpected. But like I say, in living through these years, and I kept thinking, I hope Suzanne is right. And so when I knew that she was, and then I was expecting the book, and then there was a lot of drama about being able to read the book, because you had to go in person to read the book in a room, because obviously all of the care that had to be taken, there were only like a finite number of hard copies of the book. It was very, very cloak and dagger, very exciting.
And so once you did read the book, did you know immediately that you were going to bring this one to life on screen as well?
Unequivocally, yeah. I mean, I was riveted. I was weirdly happy that I got to be locked in a room with the book and some snacks, and that like nobody could bother me or talk to me or anything. And that I just had to be in a little cone of silence for the book, because I was so captivated by it. And, I do read a lot, but Suzanne has an extraordinary ability to reel you in and hold you close and not let go, even after you've finished the book and closed it. So yes, I knew unequivocally that we would want to adapt it. And that, it presented different challenges than the others. Certainly a bigger book, a longer book. But I knew for sure that, yes, there was no way we wouldn't want to see it adapted and on the big screen.
Mm-hmm. And this prequel book also introduced fans to a new female District 12 tribute in Lucy Gray Baird. And like Katniss, she's an underestimated and truly formidable force in the Hunger Games. But how is Lucy different from Katniss?
I mean, in my interpretation, I mean, I think that Lucy Gray has had to be a performer already in her life. I mean, Katniss is thrust into the limelight and sort of learns the rules of the game as she's playing the game in being a performer. Lucy Gray has been a performer and actually knows how to handle an audience going in, and is, again, I think if you look at the history of the Hunger Games, really one of the first contestants to actually understand the element of show and approaches it differently that way. And because she is always a performer, you never really know where her thoughts lie or her affections lie or her strategy lies. Whereas Katniss, I think, is a much more direct. If she is mad at you, you know that she is mad at you. If she is feeling any way, if she is going for something, she goes for it. Whereas I feel Lucy Gray is more someone who just keeps her very bright and colorful poker face on while she tries to figure out what her next move is.
Mm-hmm. And I know I am, a part of a huge group of fans who is excited to see this book come to life on screen, like all the other Hunger Games books has. We know Francis Lawrence is returning after he helmed the Hunger Games Catching Fire and the Hunger Games Mockingjay Parts 1 and 2. So Nina, what excited you about returning to this world again by bringing this prequel to life?
Well, I do. I think I'm very excited about Lucy and introducing Lucy. And I love for, the fans, the kind of connective tissue between Lucy and District 12 and Katniss and the Hunger Games movies. I thought that Suzanne, like the weaving of that connective tissue and what Snow's history is with 12, when he comes back to Katniss. I think that the first movies will be even richer for living in a world with this prequel. But I also think that, Lucy is a character who she's much more aware of like the power of her femininity. She's much more, Katniss is actually a very quiet, a woman of few words. I think Lucy as a performer is a very different kind of character. And also, I love the idea that, and Katniss has Katniss is very survival oriented. She hunts for her family. She goes into the games because she promises her sister she'll be back. I think that somebody like Lucy, I think is interesting as well, because one of the references I use when I read and when we started talking to Francis and everything is I was obsessed with this podcast called Dolly Parton's America, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. And in it, Dolly Parton, many people, because she is clearly has written so much about women, so much about class struggle, but that she doesn't ever take a side politically. And she's like, I'm an entertainer. My role is to entertain. I don't really, and I want to reach as many people as I can. And I don't want anybody to feel like they're not welcome to be entertained by me based on a side that I would take. And I think that Lucy, that notion of Lucy is very different than someone like Katniss, who knows exactly how she feels and what she values. And I think that Lucy's more mysterious in part because she is an entertainer and she is a performer and she is playing in her own way to the crowd. And so I think they're very different characters, but really a fun, very different character to bring to the screen.
Mm-hmm. And based on that, obviously it's still very early on, but what can you tell us about how this prequel is going to compare to the original movies?
Well, it is very early on. I think that they do take place in very different times. This is the 10th Hunger Games as opposed to Catching Fire is the 75th. So speaking to some of the things that, that David, you mentioned, I think that there's the Hunger Games are considerably less glitzy than they ultimately become. So I think there's a lot of fun in that, and then seeing what they used to be, and that will be interesting. And I think that seeing, a capital character with a point of view that takes you through a good part of the story is something we've never really done. We've had great capital characters, but we've only really ever seen them through the eyes of our district protagonists. We've never really seen the world through the eyes of a capital, especially a Snow, and a capital character.
Mm-hmm. And no spoilers, but David, Ballad clearly sets up a wonderful opportunity to make the prequel into another full book franchise based on how it ends and everything we learn about Snow and Panem in this time period. So are there any plans to continue Snow's origin story with more books?
What was the phrase I just used? Bright and colorful poker face? Yeah. I'm lobbying hard for some crossover. I'd like for them to go to Jurassic Park. I feel that would be interesting to see a Velociraptor versus Snow and see how they interacted. Suzanne has not accepted this pitch from me, so I don't know that that's going to happen. No, again, I truly don't know what the next steps are. But again, I think that it will be interesting to see whatever Suzanne does next, whether in Panem or out of Panem.
Mm-hmm. And while I could talk about the Hunger Games and Ballad all day long, that's about all the time we have. So thank you, David and Nina, for joining me today. A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is available now, and I cannot wait to see it brought to life on screen, hopefully soon. May the odds be ever in our favor.